Harlem, October 1948. A rival mob boss spread the word across 12 city blocks. Bumpy Johnson was finished. He had the money. He had the guns. But within 3 days, his Cadillac was burning on Lenox Avenue and $150,000 vanished into the night. So what exactly did Bumpy Johnson do that made an entire mob crew disappear without a single public shot fired? To understand how it all unraveled, we go back to where the lie began. Harlem smelled like cigarette smoke and rain-soaked concrete on the night it started. The jazz clubs on Lenox Avenue were still running, horns and piano bleeding through thin walls. But something underneath the music had changed. The air felt tighter. The laughter at the bar stools was a half-second too slow. Men who usually slapped each other on the back stood a little farther apart, eyes moving toward the door more than usual. The word had come down from Brooklyn 2 days earlier. Quiet at first, the way a fire starts before anyone smells the smoke. Vince Moretti had sent it through 3 different mouths across 3 different neighborhoods. By the time it reached Harlem, it wasn't a rumor anymore. It had weight. It had detail. Bumpy Johnson was broke. His numbers operation was bleeding out. Half his crew had already stopped showing up. The man who had held 125th Street through beatings, betrayals, and 2 federal investigations was finally, irreversibly finished. That was the story Moretti needed Harlem to believe. And Harlem, for a few cold October days, was beginning to. The barbershops carried it first, then the church steps, then the kitchen tables where women counted rent money and whispered to their husbands that maybe it was time to stop paying the street tax to a man who couldn't protect his own operation anymore. A neighborhood doesn't shift all at once. It shifts one conversation at a time, one small decision at a time, until one morning you wake up and the map has changed without a single shot fired. Moretti understood this better than most men in his position. He was not the biggest boss in New York. He did not have the deepest pockets or the most soldiers. What he had was patience and a precise understanding of how power actually worked on the street level. Power was not guns. Power was not money. Not entirely. Power was the story people told about you when you weren't in the room. If he could replace Bumpy's story with his own, Harlem would hand itself over without a war. He had done it before, in 2 smaller neighborhoods in Queens. It had worked both times. What Moretti did not account for was the man sitting in a back booth at a diner on 132nd Street, drinking black coffee and saying absolutely nothing. Bumpy Johnson had known about the rumor campaign for 72 hours before most of Harlem heard the first version of it. He had a source inside a Brooklyn social club, a man who cleaned floors and remembered everything he heard. The source had passed word through a laundry delivery route that Moretti's people never thought to watch. By the time the barbershops were buzzing, Bumpy already had the full shape of what was coming. He told no one except Junie Bird. Junie was not the biggest man in Bumpy's operation, and he was not the most feared. What Junie was invisible. He had a face that people forgot immediately, a voice that blended into background noise, and the ability to stand in a crowded room for 2 hours without a single person remembering he'd been there. Bumpy had understood this about Junie for 15 years and had used it accordingly. On the night the rumors started moving, Bumpy gave Junie one instruction. Don't stop them. Don't correct them. Just watch who repeats it with a smile. Junie spent the next 48 hours moving through Harlem like smoke. He sat at the end of bars. He stood near the back of pool halls. He lingered on sidewalks outside numbers drops, close enough to hear conversations through open windows, and in a small notebook he kept in his left breast pocket. He wrote down names. Not the names of people who repeated the rumor out of fear or confusion. Those people Bumpy understood. Fear was rational. Fear he could work with. Junie wrote down the names of the people who repeated it with relief, the ones who leaned forward when they said it, whose voices picked up half a register, who looked around after they spoke to see if anyone important had heard them align themselves with the new story. Those were the people who had already made a decision. Those were the people who had, in the silence of their own minds, chosen Moretti before Moretti had even made a formal offer. Captain Walter Keegan of the NYPD stopped by the diner on the second night. He sat across from Bumpy without being invited, ordered coffee he didn't touch, and spoke low enough that the waitress 3 feet away couldn't hear him. "You know what they're saying." "I've heard some of it," Bumpy said. "You're not going to address it. A man who chases every rumor confirms he's afraid of them." Keegan studied him for a moment. The captain had a complicated relationship with Bumpy Johnson that official records would never fully capture. As Harlem's street economy and the precinct's operational realities had been quietly intertwined for years, he had seen Bumpy in tight situations before. He had never seen him look like this, completely still, coffee cup held in both hands, eyes focused on the middle distance, like a man watching something nobody else could see yet. "Moretti's serious this time," Keegan said. "Most men are serious until they're not," Bumpy said. Keegan left without finishing his coffee. Outside, Lenox Avenue moved the way it always moved at night, cabs and foot traffic and music drifting from 3 different directions at once. But the old men who sat on the same stoops every evening, the ones who had watched this neighborhood shift through decades of violence and reinvention, noticed something that younger eyes missed. Bumpy Johnson's corner boys were not on their corners, not because they had run, because they had been told quietly and specifically to step back and let the street think whatever it wanted to think for a few more days. The throne looked empty. Moretti needed it to look empty. What he didn't know was that the man who sat on it was already counting the names of everyone who had moved toward it while he was supposedly gone. In this world, power rarely dies from a bullet first. It dies from a story. And Bumpy Johnson had decided, with complete calm, that he would let Moretti write the story all the way to the end before he turned the page. The old men on Lenox said the neighborhood was unusually quiet that week. They were right, but quiet in Harlem was never empty. It was always waiting. The money started moving wrong on a Tuesday. It wasn't dramatic at first. A numbers runner named Calvin, who covered the blocks between 126th and 130th, came in light by $40. He had an explanation ready. Some story about a customer who'd paid in "I owe us," and under normal circumstances it might have passed without comment. But Bumpy's bookkeeper, a thin, precise man named Eddie Numbers Cole, didn't work on normal circumstances. He worked on patterns. Eddie had been keeping Harlem's underground financial records for 11 years. He had a memory for figures that bordered on unnatural, the kind of recall that meant he could tell you what a specific runner had brought in on a Tuesday 3 months ago and compare it against this Tuesday without consulting a single page of notes. When Calvin came in light, Eddie wrote it down. When a club owner on 128th Street delayed his weekly envelope by 2 days without sending word ahead, Eddie wrote that down too. By Wednesday night, he had 6 anomalies. By Thursday morning, he had 11. He brought the notebook to Bumpy at the diner on 132nd Street and placed it on the table without a word. Bumpy read through it slowly, turning pages with one finger, his expression not changing. Outside, a delivery truck rattled past, and the smell of exhaust and fried food drifted in through the gap under the door. "How many of these are fear?" Bumpy asked. 3, maybe 4, Eddie said. "The rest know exactly what they're doing." This was the distinction that mattered. In any operation built on loyalty, enforced by proximity and consequence, a certain number of people would always drift toward whoever appeared to be winning. It was not personal, and it was not ideology. It was arithmetic. These were people who had families, who had debts, who had made quiet calculations about survival and concluded that the safest position was the one closest to power. Bumpy did not hate these people. He had grown up watching his own neighbors make the same calculations under worse conditions. What he did not tolerate was the ones who moved with enthusiasm. Moretti's offer had come through Frankie Doss, a courier who ran between Brooklyn and Harlem 3 times a week under the cover of a dry-cleaning pickup route. Frankie was 26, quick on his feet, and deeply convinced that he was smarter than the people who employed him. He had approached 3 club owners and 2 senior numbers men with the same basic pitch: Moretti was coming in regardless. The question was whether you were remembered as someone who helped the transition or someone who had to be dealt with afterward. And it was a clean, effective approach. Moretti had used it before. Sister Bernice Hall heard about it on Thursday afternoon from a woman in her congregation, whose husband ran a small card game on 131st Street. Sister Bernice was not a criminal and had no interest in becoming one, but she was the single most connected person in a 12-block radius of her church, and she had the kind of authority in Harlem that came not from fear, but from decades of showing up when things went wrong. She had fed people during the 43 food shortages. She had organized bail money for young men arrested on inflated charges. She knew every family on 6 blocks by name, by history, and by what they owed, and were owed. When something moved through the neighborhood's moral atmosphere, Sister Bernice felt it the way a barometer feels weather. She did not go to Bumpy directly. She went to the woman who cleaned Bumpy's office on Friday mornings and made sure that woman mentioned, in passing, that the congregation was nervous. That was enough. Bumpy's response to all of it was to do nothing visible. He did not summon the club owners. He did not confront the runners who had come in light. He did not send anyone to find Frankie Doss and deliver a message through the usual physical vocabulary of Harlem discipline. Instead, he told Eddie Cole to keep the money moving exactly as it had been, even through the hands of people who were now, quietly, also moving money toward Brooklyn. Eddie looked at him for a long moment. "You want them to keep stealing from you? I want them to think they are," Bumpy said. The logic was specific and cold. If Bumpy cut off the men who were shifting allegiance, Moretti would know immediately that the network had been identified. The leak would seal itself, and Moretti would adjust his approach. But if the money kept flowing, if Frankie Doss kept making his dry cleaning runs and the club owners kept sending partial envelopes in both directions, then every piece of information Moretti received about Bumpy's operation would be information Bumpy had chosen to let him receive. The network of betrayal became, in Bumpy's hands, a network of controlled intelligence. What neither Frankie Doss nor the club owners understood was that Eddie Cole was not just tracking what they sent to Brooklyn. He was tracking the timing, the amounts, and the specific details each person chose to share. Different men knew different things about Bumpy's operation. By mapping what Moretti appeared to know against who knew what, Bumpy could construct a precise picture of exactly who was talking and exactly how much they had given away. By Friday evening, the list in Junie Bird's notebook had grown to 19 names. Bumpy sat with it for a long time that night. 19 people out of an operation that touched hundreds. On one level, it was a manageable number. On another level, it was a warning, because these were not the frightened ones, not the people who had wavered and then steadied themselves. These were people who had looked at what Bumpy had built over 15 years and decided it was already over. The books that went missing that week were never formally reported anywhere, as the nature of Harlem's economy made official accounting both impossible and dangerous. But the men who drank in the back booths of certain bars on Lenox Avenue would talk about those missing envelopes for years, in the careful, quiet way that people discuss things they were glad not to have been caught near. Betrayal, Bumpy understood, rarely needed a grand reason. It just needed a man to look at the odds and pick the side he thought would win. What those 19 people had not yet understood was that the odds they were calculating were odds Bumpy had arranged for them to see. The real numbers were kept somewhere else entirely. On Saturday morning, Luther Kane staged an ambush that was never meant to succeed. This was Moretti's idea, and it was by the standards of Brooklyn Street Theater, a reasonably sophisticated one. Kane was Moretti's best operator in the field, a man with 15 years of experience running pressure campaigns in neighborhoods where direct confrontation was too expensive or too visible. He understood that the goal was not to actually catch Bumpy Johnson in an alley on 127th Street, The goal was to make Harlem believe that Bumpy Johnson had run from an alley on 127th Street. The distinction was everything. Kane used 4 men. He positioned them at the mouth of an alley that Bumpy's car was known to pass on weekend mornings, a detail pulled from information Frankie Doss had supplied earlier in the week. He made sure 2 of the men were visible from the street, standing in a way that said threat without ambiguity. He told them that if Bumpy's car appeared, they were to advance slowly and then stop when the car rerouted. No shots, no contact, just enough presence to generate witnesses who would later report that Bumpy Johnson had turned his car around on 127th Street on a Saturday morning. In Harlem's information economy, that image was worth more than a beating. Bumpy's car did not appear. What appeared instead was a 1946 Buick with 2 of Junie's men inside, who drove slowly past the mouth of the alley, clocked all 4 of Kane's people, noted their faces and positions, and continued up the block without stopping. 20 minutes later, Junie had the report. He passed it to Bumpy by phone through a relay that used a laundromat on 133rd Street as a middle point, a system they had been running for 2 years. Bumpy listened. Then he told Junie where he was going that morning. Reverend Amos Clay had led the congregation of Mount Moriah Baptist Church on 129th Street for 22 years. He was 64 years old, built like a man who had done physical labor for the first half of his life, with a voice that could fill a room without effort and a reputation for personal honesty that had survived every storm the neighborhood had thrown at it. He had baptized children whose parents he had also baptized. He had officiated funerals for men who had died in circumstances that the police report described one way and the neighborhood understood entirely differently. He and Bumpy Johnson had a relationship that neither of them ever described publicly, built on a shared understanding that Harlem required both the church and the street to function, and that the people who lived between those 2 worlds needed someone in each who could be trusted to tell the truth. At 10:45 on Saturday morning, Bumpy Johnson walked through the front door of Mount Moriah Baptist Church. He was not hiding. He was not hurrying. He wore a dark suit and a hat he removed when he crossed the threshold, and he walked up the center aisle of a church that held, at that moment, somewhere between 200 and 230 people who had come for the regular Saturday prayer service. He took a seat 3 rows from the front, nodded to Reverend Clay, who was standing at the pulpit reviewing his notes, and folded his hands in his lap. The room noticed immediately, not loudly. Nobody stood up or pointed, but the awareness moved through the congregation the way awareness always moved in enclosed spaces, a ripple of shifted posture and eyes that moved and then very deliberately moved away. Within 4 minutes, everyone in that church knew that Bumpy Johnson was sitting 3 rows from the front. Within 20 minutes, everyone within 3 blocks who had a reason to pay attention to such things knew it too. Luther Kane's men were still standing at the mouth of the alley on 127th Street. The contrast could not have been more precise. Moretti's operation had spent a week building a story about a man who was hiding, who was running, who had gone to ground because the walls were closing in, and on a Saturday morning, in front of 200 witnesses who included teachers and grandmothers and deacons and small business owners, that man was sitting in church with his hat in his hands and his back straight. Reverend Clay preached that morning on the subject of patience. It was a sermon he had given variations of many times before, drawn from the book of James, about the relationship between waiting and strength. He did not deviate from his prepared text. He did not look at Bumpy more than once. But at the end of the service, when the congregation filed out and the usual slow dispersal of handshakes and conversations filled the front steps, Clay walked to where Bumpy stood and gripped his hand for a long moment. He said nothing. Neither did Bumpy. They did not need to. The image of that handshake traveled through Harlem faster than any newspaper could have carried it. By early afternoon, the story had already shifted. Not the rumor that Bumpy was finished that was still running, still being fed by Moretti's channels. But underneath it, a countercurrent had started. A quieter story, the kind that moved through kitchens and church basements, rather than barbershops and pool halls. The story of a man who had walked into the most public room in his neighborhood on the morning his enemies said he was hiding, and had sat in the third row from the front without flinching. Moretti was informed of this by early evening. He received the report in a restaurant in Carroll Gardens, ate the rest of his meal in silence, and then told the man across from him that the reputation attack had failed. "Fine," he said. "We go after the money." It was the right conclusion. Moretti was not a stupid man. He understood that if walking through a church door had neutralized his psychological campaign, then the only remaining lever was financial. Cut the revenue streams, starve the operation, make it impossible for Bumpy to pay his people, protect his territory, or maintain the infrastructure that kept Harlem running under his name. A man could survive a rumor. He could not survive an empty treasury. What Moretti did not know was that the move toward financial pressure was exactly what Bumpy had been waiting for him to make. The ambush on 127th Street was written up in no official record anywhere, for obvious reasons, but people who were in the neighborhood that Saturday remembered the detail that struck them most. Not the church visit itself, but the fact that when Bumpy Johnson left Mount Moriah Baptist that morning, he stopped on the front steps to speak to 3 elderly women who had known him since he was a boy. He stayed for 11 minutes. Nobody who watched him leave said a word. They just watched. And later, in the way that Harlem processed things it couldn't fully explain, several people who had been on the edge of choosing Moretti decided, without announcing it to anyone, to wait a little longer before making that choice. In Harlem, showing up at the right moment could hit harder than any bullet. The people who saw Bumpy Johnson walk out of that church on a Saturday morning understood this in their bones, even if none of them could have explained exactly why. Junie Bird found the hole on a Sunday night, and it was smaller than he expected. That was the thing about information leaks. People imagined them as broken dams, catastrophic and obvious. In reality, they looked like a single damp patch on a wall, easy to miss, devastating if ignored. Junie had spent 3 days cross-referencing the timing of Moretti's moves against the specific details each man in Bumpy's inner circle actually knew. It was slow, careful work, the kind that required patience Junie had developed over 15 years of surviving in a business where impatience killed people with regularity. The pattern became clear on Sunday at 9:30. Every time Bumpy had shifted a pickup location in the past 3 weeks, Moretti's people had repositioned within 48 hours. Not perfectly, not with full information, but close enough that coincidence stopped being a reasonable explanation after the 4th instance. Junie went back further, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and the pattern held. Someone had been feeding Brooklyn a running account of Bumpy's operational adjustments. Not everything, not the top-level strategy, but the street-level logistics that made the operation breathe. There were 11 men who had access to that specific layer of information. Junie eliminated 8 of them through alibi, loyalty history, and a clear-eyed assessment of who had something to gain. That left 3. He watched all 3 for 48 hours. He was down to 1 by Monday morning. Frankie Doss, the dry-cleaning courier, the young man with quick feet and a deep conviction that he was operating at a higher level than the people around him. Frankie had been running his Brooklyn route for 14 months, and in that time he had built a careful second income by selling precisely calibrated pieces of information to Moretti's people through a contact he met at a diner in Bay Ridge every Thursday afternoon. He was not reckless about it. He sold nothing that would get him immediately identified. He sold operational details, timing adjustments, the kind of information that looked like coincidence even when it wasn't. He had been at it for 11 weeks. Junie brought this to Bumpy on Monday morning at the diner on 132nd Street. He placed his notes on the table the same way Eddie Cole had placed his numbers notebook 4 days earlier, and waited. Bumpy read through the pages without expression. He turned each page slowly. He finished, set the notes down, picked up his coffee cup, and looked out the window at Lenox Avenue waking up in the gray October morning. The delivery trucks and the early foot traffic and the pigeons working the sidewalk outside the bakery across the street. "You know what I used Frankie to carry to Brooklyn," he said. Junie went still. 3 weeks ago, Bumpy continued, I gave Frankie the delivery schedule for the 128th Street drop. Specific times, specific amounts. I gave him numbers that were real enough to believe, but wrong in one specific way. The amounts were inflated by 30%. Junie processed this quietly. Moretti thinks you're moving more than you are. Moretti thinks I'm moving 30% more than I am, which means when he calculates how long it takes to starve me out financially, his timeline is wrong. He thinks I have more reserves than I do, which means he'll hold back longer before he commits his full pressure. Bumpy set the cup down. I also gave Frankie the wrong pickup location for the Tuesday collection 2 weeks ago. Moretti sent 2 men to an address on 127th Street that processes dry goods. They sat outside for 3 hours. Junie was quiet for a moment. You knew about Frankie before I did. I suspected. I didn't know. You confirmed it. How long have you suspected? Since the 3rd week of September. Junie sat back. Outside. A car horn sounded twice and then stopped. The smell of coffee and frying butter drifted from the kitchen at the back of the diner. He thought about the past 3 weeks, about the careful work he had done to trace the leak, the hours spent cross-referencing and eliminating and narrowing, and he understood now that all of that work had been real and necessary, but it had been happening inside a frame that Bumpy had already constructed. So Frankie thinks he's stealing from you, Junie said. Frankie is stealing from me. Bumpy said, he's just stealing what I left out for him. The most dangerous man in any operation. Bumpy had understood for a long time. Was not the man who betrayed you. Betrayal was a known variable. It happened with enough regularity that any serious organization had to account for it structurally, the way a building accounted for wind load. The most dangerous man was the one who knew he was being betrayed and said nothing, because that man controlled not just his own actions, but the actions of everyone who thought they were deceiving him. Frankie Doss had 11 weeks of practice believing he was the smartest person in the room. He had 11 weeks of practice being exactly where Bumpy needed him. What do we do with him now? Junie asked. Nothing yet. Moretti is about to move on the money. I need Frankie to carry one more piece of information to Brooklyn before that happens. Whoa, what information? Bumpy told him. Junie listened without interrupting. When Bumpy finished, Junie was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, if Moretti believes that, he'll commit his full crew to the financial pressure before he's ready. Yes, and when he commits his full crew before he's ready, he'll be exposed on his left side. Yes. Junie looked at the notes on the table. 11 weeks of Frankie Doss believing he was running a private operation inside Bumpy's organization. 11 weeks of Moretti building a strategy on a foundation that had been quietly, methodically undermined from the beginning. What felt like a catastrophic discovery, a mole at the center of the operation, was actually the most controlled variable in the entire situation. Several detectives who later reviewed the events of that October would note that the case files contained unusual gaps, missing courier logs and delivery records that should have existed but never surfaced, which investigators attributed to the informal nature of Harlem's street economy at the time. Junie picked up his notes and folded them into his jacket pocket. You want me to tell Frankie what to carry? Tell him you found something in the books, Bumpy said. Let him think he found it himself. Frankie needs to believe every idea that serves us is his own idea. Junie nodded and stood up. He left $2 on the table for the coffee and walked out into the October morning without looking back. Bumpy stayed at the table for another 20 minutes, watching the street. The most dangerous man was never the betrayer. It was always the man who already knew, and had decided exactly what to do about it. 3 weeks before anyone else in the room understood there was a problem. The money Moretti spent that week was real, and it was substantial. He did not do it carelessly. Moretti had built his operation in Brooklyn over 19 years through a combination of violence applied at precise moments and financial incentives that were generous enough to make loyalty feel like a reasonable business decision. He understood that naked fear created compliance, but not reliability, and that the men you paid well were the men who showed up when things got difficult. He brought this same philosophy to Harlem. By Tuesday morning, 3 club owners on Lenox had accepted envelopes from Moretti's courier. Not large amounts, $150 each, which in October of 1948 represented real money for a small club running on thin margins through a slow autumn season. The envelopes came with a simple verbal message. Moretti respected their operation, expected nothing in return at this time, and wanted them to know that when the transition happened, people who had been treated well would continue to be treated well. It was a clean offer. No threats attached, no immediate obligations. 2 of the 3 club owners spent Tuesday night unable to sleep. Moretti also moved on Captain Keegan's precinct, not through Keegan himself, who was too established and too careful to be approached directly, but through 2 junior officers who covered beats on 126th and 130th Street. The approach was the same: cash, modest amounts, no explicit ask, just an introduction and a demonstration that Moretti's people were present, organized, and capable of making certain kinds of problems easier to manage. One of the 2 officers took the money. The other reported the approach to Keegan the following morning. Keegan sat with that information for 4 hours before doing anything with it. Meanwhile, Moretti's men began appearing in the territories of 3 independent protection operators who covered restaurants and small businesses on the western blocks. These were men who worked for themselves, not directly for Bumpy, but within a system that Bumpy's presence made possible. Moretti's pitch to them was slightly different, more explicit, more forward-looking. There would be a reorganization, he said through his intermediaries. Men who were already in conversation with the new structure would find their territories respected and possibly expanded. Men who waited too long to have that conversation might find their arrangements less comfortable. It was pressure applied with precision, not a threat, an observation about the near future stated as established fact. By Wednesday, Harlem's informal power structure was experiencing something it had not felt in several years: genuine uncertainty about who held the center. What Moretti did not see, because it generated no visible activity and left almost no trace in the places his people were watching, was the parallel campaign Bumpy had been running for the same 72 hours. It started with the families. There were, in any given week, between 30 and 40 men in Rikers Island or the Manhattan detention complex whose families lived within Bumpy's operational territory. These were not men who worked for Bumpy. Not all of them. Some were entirely disconnected from the street economy. But their families, wives and mothers and children, were living in Harlem on reduced or no income, navigating rent and groceries and utility bills with the compressed desperation that came from having a husband or son or father removed from the household economy without warning. Bumpy had always maintained a quiet fund for these families, not publicly, not in any way that could be tracked or attributed. Cash delivered through church networks and community organizations, rent paid through third parties, grocery accounts settled at certain stores with no name attached to the transaction. He had been doing this for years. It was not charity in the way he thought about it. It was infrastructure. These families were Harlem, and Harlem was the thing he was actually protecting. In the week Moretti was distributing envelopes to club owners, Bumpy doubled the fund. The bills paid that winter carried no signatures, no names, no paper trail that connected them to any single source, a reality that reflected both the nature of community support networks in Harlem and the practical requirements of operating outside official financial systems. Maybelle Parker was not one of the families receiving assistance. She was a singer who had been performing at a lounge on 131st Street for 6 years. The kind of performer who kept a room full and drinking without ever becoming famous enough to leave. She knew everyone in 3 blocks in every direction, and people told her things in the way they told bartenders and hairdressers things, because she was present and consistent and because her face did not carry judgment. On Wednesday night, after her second set, she sat down next to Junie Bird at the end of the bar. 2 of Moretti's men came in last night, she said. Sat in the back. Didn't drink much. Watched the room. What were they watching? Who talked to who? Who laughed too loud? Who looked comfortable? She paused. They came back tonight. Different table. Same watching. Junie relayed this to Bumpy that night by phone through the laundromat relay. Bumpy told him what to tell Maybelle, which was to continue her sets and change nothing about her behavior, but to note the nights the men returned, and which specific conversations they seemed most interested in observing. Maybelle became, without any formal arrangement or payment, one of the most reliable intelligence sources Bumpy had in that 10-day stretch. The protection operators were the third front. Moretti's people had approached 3 of them. What Moretti's people did not know was that all 3 had been in conversation with Junie Bird before those approaches happened. Not because Bumpy had anticipated the exact moment Moretti would move on them, but because he had been maintaining those relationships for years with the specific understanding that independent operators needed to feel respected rather than managed. When Moretti's men arrived with their forward-looking observations about the near future, 2 of the 3 operators already had a standing channel to Bumpy's organization and used it within hours. The third took Moretti's meeting, listened carefully, and then called a number he had been given 18 months earlier and had never used. By Thursday morning, Bumpy knew the specific language Moretti's intermediaries were using, the exact framing of the offer, the implied timeline, and the names of 2 of the 4 men Moretti was using to make these approaches. Captain Keegan came to the diner again on Thursday afternoon. He sat across from Bumpy and placed a folded piece of paper on the table between them. Bumpy looked at it without picking it up. "One of my officers was approached." Keegan said, "I know." Keegan studied him. "Of course you do." He pushed the paper slightly closer. "That's the name of the man who made the approach. What you do with it is your business." Bumpy left the paper on the table. "I don't need it." Keegan nodded slowly. He had been a police captain in Harlem for 9 years, and he had developed, through proximity and observation, a fairly sophisticated understanding of how power actually functioned in the neighborhood he nominally policed. He had seen operators come and go. He had watched men with more money and more soldiers than Bumpy fail to hold what they took because they had mistaken territorial control for community trust. "Moretti's buying a lot of goodwill this week," Keegan said. "He's buying tonight." Bumpy said, "I'm buying the whole winter." Outside, the October wind pushed a newspaper down the sidewalk and pressed it against a lamppost. The club owners who had taken Moretti's envelopes were, at that same moment, realizing something they hadn't fully processed when the cash changed hands. Moretti's money bought a decision. Bumpy's presence, his history, his quiet payments to families, and his protection of small businesses from the opportunistic theft that spiked whenever a power vacuum appeared, that bought something harder to name and infinitely more durable. The back doors of Harlem were beginning to open differently depending on who knocked. Moretti's men were finding more hesitation, more questions, more requests to come back tomorrow. Bumpy's people were being waved through without a word. Money could purchase an evening, but order, real order, the kind that made a neighborhood feel safe enough to sleep that purchased everything else. Moretti chose the back room of a restaurant on 133rd Street for the meeting, and this decision revealed, more than anything else he did that week, the precise boundary of what he understood about Harlem. The restaurant was called Delano's. It had been operating since 1931, a narrow place with dark wood paneling and tables covered in white cloth that had seen better decades, serving a combination of Southern food and Italian dishes that reflected the neighborhood's layered history. The back room held 12 people comfortably, and 16 if you removed 2 of the tables. Moretti had arranged to use it through an intermediary who told the owner it was a private dinner for a business association. The owner, a man named Gerald Fitch who had run the restaurant for 11 years, agreed without asking questions. This was, in itself, a piece of information. Gerald Fitch was not a man who did favors for people he didn't know without a reason. Junie Bird had a cup of coffee with Gerald Fitch on Thursday afternoon. The meeting was set for Friday night at 10 o'clock. Moretti had invited 8 men, 4 senior numbers operators, 2 club owners who had already accepted his envelopes, and 2 independent protection men whose territories covered the western blocks. It was not an invitation that could be refused without consequence, and everyone who received it understood this. The framing was collegial. Moretti wanted to meet the men who ran Harlem's economy, hear their concerns, and explain his vision for how things would work going forward. The subtext was simple: show up or be categorized as a problem to be solved, rather than a partner to be accommodated. 6 of the 8 confirmed they would attend. The other 2 sent word that they had prior obligations but hoped to be included in future conversations. This was, in the language of Harlem street diplomacy, a message that required no translation. Eddie Cole arrived at Delano's at 7:15, 3 hours before the meeting. He came through the kitchen entrance carrying a canvas bag and wearing a waiter's jacket he had acquired through channels that Gerald Fitch had helpfully suggested. The kitchen staff, all 4 of them, had been briefed by Gerald in terms that were clear and required no elaboration. Eddie set up his position near the service station at the edge of the back room, where he could hear everything said at the main table while remaining in the peripheral vision of men who were focused on each other. A man named Roosevelt, who usually worked as a coat check attendant at a club on 128th Street, took a position near the room's single door. He was not armed in any visible way. He was simply present, the way furniture is present, integrated into the environment in a manner that drew no attention. Luther Kane arrived with Moretti at 9:50, 2 of Moretti's other men behind them. Kane swept the room the way a man with his experience always swept a room, checking corners and exits and the positions of everyone present. He saw the waiter near the service station, a middle-aged man with a slight build who was arranging glasses with the careful attention of someone who took his work seriously. He saw the coat check man near the door, unremarkable in every particular. He saw Gerald Fitch standing near the kitchen entrance with his hands clasped in the posture of a restaurateur who wanted his guests to feel welcome. Kane saw nothing that concerned him. This was the most significant failure of his professional career, though he would not understand this until several days later. Moretti took the chair at the head of the table. The 8 invited men, 6 who had confirmed and 2 who arrived without prior confirmation, arranged themselves around him. The food came out on schedule, good food, properly prepared, the kind of meal that created an atmosphere of comfort and normalcy that Moretti had specifically requested because he understood that men made better agreements when they were eating well. He began speaking at 10:17. The pitch was structured and confident. Harlem was a significant economic territory that had been, in Moretti's assessment, underorganized for years. Bumpy Johnson had built something real. He acknowledged this directly and without condescension. But Bumpy Johnson's time was ending. Not because Moretti was forcing it. He said this carefully. But because the economics had shifted in ways that required a different kind of organization. Larger-scale coordination. Better connections to distribution networks outside the neighborhood. Protection that extended beyond Harlem's borders to the places where the money ultimately moved. He offered specific numbers, revenue projections, protection guarantees, a transitional arrangement that would allow current operators to maintain their positions under a reorganized structure with Brooklyn providing the infrastructure backbone. It was a polished presentation. The men around the table listened with the careful attention of people who were weighing a decision that would determine the next several years of their lives. Eddie Cole listened too. He memorized every number Moretti spoke, every name he mentioned, every implicit threat embedded in the language of opportunity, the specific dollar amounts attached to each operator's projected share, the timeline Moretti described for completing the transition, which was 45 days, a detail that told Bumpy's organization something precise and useful about how Moretti had assessed the situation. Roosevelt near the door memorized the faces of Moretti's 2 men, and the specific words Kane used when he leaned over to Moretti twice during the presentation, to add details Moretti had omitted. Gerald Fitch, moving between kitchen and dining room with the natural rhythm of a man in his own establishment, heard the parts of the conversation that happened before the formal presentation began, the unguarded exchanges between Moretti and Kane that contained information Moretti would never have shared at the main table. By 11:45, when the meeting concluded and the men filed out into the cold night air, Moretti believed he had conducted a successful opening negotiation with Harlem's financial operators. What had actually happened was that Bumpy Johnson had attended the meeting through 3 sets of ears and remembered every word. The names that passed through that room on Friday night never appeared in any official report or investigation, a gap that officers who later reviewed the period would find puzzling, given the number of law enforcement contacts present in Harlem's business community at the time. Junie received the full debrief from Eddie and Roosevelt by 2 in the morning. He was at Bumpy's apartment on 145th Street by 2:30, sitting across from a man who had not attended the meeting in any physical sense, and yet somehow seemed to have been the only person in that room who knew exactly what was happening. He gave them a 45-day timeline. Junie said, "He's wrong about how much time he has." Bumpy said, "How much does he have?" Bumpy looked at the window. Outside, Harlem was doing what it always did at 3 in the morning, running quieter but never quite silent. The city underneath the city still moving, still breathing, still conducting its real business in the hours when official observation had gone to sleep. "He has until his men decide they haven't been paid what they were promised," Bumpy said. "That's not 45 days. That's closer to 7. The greatest mistake a man could make when walking into someone else's territory was to assume that because the room was dark, it was empty. Moretti had walked into a room that belonged to someone else entirely, surrounded by ears he had not counted and eyes he had not seen, and had delivered a complete account of his plans, his timeline, his financial projections, and the names of the men he was counting on. He had given Bumpy everything, and he had driven back to Brooklyn believing the evening had been a success. Moretti's plan for Saturday was simple and brutal. He had identified 4 primary revenue collection points that fed Bumpy's operation: 2 numbers drops on the east side of Lenox, a card room on 129th Street, and a liquor distribution arrangement that ran through a loading dock behind a grocery on 131st. His intention was not to steal the money. His intention was to make the collection impossible. Block the runners, intimidate the operators, create enough disruption that the week's revenue simply didn't move, and do it for 3 consecutive weeks until Bumpy couldn't meet his payroll. A man who can't pay his people stops being a man with people. Luther Kane had positioned 11 men across those 4 locations by 7 Saturday morning. They were not Harlem men. Moretti had brought them from 2 different Brooklyn crews specifically to avoid the problem of local soldiers developing local sympathies. These were men who ate well, slept in paid rooms, and collected a flat weekly rate regardless of outcome. Professional disruptors, men whose loyalty was transactional and whose effectiveness came precisely from having no personal stake in the neighborhood they were disrupting. Kane ran them well. He had done this kind of operation 4 times in other territories and understood the mechanics cleanly. You didn't need to be violent. You needed to be present and unmovable. A runner who sees 3 large men standing at the mouth of the alley where his drop point sits will make a calculation. That calculation, repeated across enough runners over enough days, produced the result Moretti needed. By 9 Saturday morning, 2 of the 4 collection points had gone dark. Junie Bird received this report by phone at 9:15 and passed it to Bumpy within the hour. Bumpy's response was not to move his collection points. It was to make a series of phone calls that had nothing to do with the collection points. The calls went to 6 different men in 3 Brooklyn neighborhoods, not enemies of Moretti, not rivals, former employees, men who had worked for Moretti's organization at various points over the past decade and had been let go, or had drifted away, or had ended their association under circumstances that left a residue of resentment. Bumpy did not know all of these men personally. What he had was a file, assembled over 2 years by Junie from conversations and observations and the kind of patient information gathering that looked like nothing until it looked like everything. Each call delivered the same piece of information. Moretti had budgeted $40 a week per man for the Harlem operation. His 11 soldiers were each being told they were receiving $60. This was not true. Bumpy had invented the number. but it was a number close enough to plausible that it required investigation. And investigation required conversation. And conversation between men who were already being paid in the gray area between loyalty and mercenary arrangement created a very specific kind of arithmetic problem. The 6 former Moretti employees did not receive cash from Bumpy. They received information and were left to do with it what men in their position naturally did, which was talk. By early afternoon, the rumor had reached 3 of Moretti's 11 men through separate channels, not as a confirmed fact, as a question, as the kind of thing one man says to another when they're standing on a corner in a neighborhood that isn't theirs, doing work that feels increasingly disconnected from a clear upside. You hear what Kane's keeping off the top. That was all it took. Frankie Doss, still operating as Moretti's unwitting carrier of false intelligence, made his Saturday afternoon run to Brooklyn with a specific piece of information Bumpy had prepared for him through Eddie Cole's carefully staged accounting ledger. The information suggested that Bumpy's main financial reserve, the fund that kept the operation liquid during disruptions, was held at a location on 134th Street that Frankie had glimpsed in what he believed was an accidentally exposed page of Eddie's notebook. The location was a vacant storage room above a dry goods shop. It had been empty for 4 months. Moretti received this information at 4 in the afternoon and made the decision to redirect 2 of his 4 location teams to cover 134th Street, convinced he had found the pressure point that would end the standoff by Sunday morning. This left 2 collection points completely unguarded. By 6 Saturday evening, Bumpy's runners had cleared both locations without incident, moving quietly and quickly through streets that suddenly had no Brooklyn soldiers watching them. The week's collection from those 2 points was intact. Not everything, but enough to meet payroll, enough to keep every man in Bumpy's organization receiving exactly what they had been promised, without a day's delay. Luther Kane discovered the redirect error at 7:30 when a runner reported that 2 of his teams had not returned from 134th Street with anything to show. He called Moretti from a payphone on 130th Street. The conversation lasted 4 minutes and ended with Moretti telling him to consolidate the remaining men and hold their positions through the night. 3 of the 11 men were not at their positions when Kane checked at 9 o'clock. They had not been threatened. They had not been confronted. They had simply, in the private arithmetic of men who sell their presence rather than their loyalty, calculated that the situation was developing in a direction that suggested the weekly rate was about to become unreliable. An army that questions its pay will hold the line until it hears something different. Those 3 men had heard something different, through 2 conversations and 1 unverifiable rumor, and they had made the rational decision available to men in their position. Kane reported the desertions to Moretti at 9:30. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted long enough to be its own answer. Junie Bird received a report of the payphone call's duration and Kane's body language afterward from a man who sold newspapers from a stand 12 feet away. He passed it to Bumpy at 10 that night. Bumpy read the report, folded it once, and placed it in his jacket pocket. "Tomorrow night," he said. "Moretti is going to drive through Lenox." Junie looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because he's running out of moves that don't require him to show up in person. And a man like Moretti, when he's losing, needs to see the territory with his own eyes before he admits it." Junie was quiet for a moment. "What do we do when he comes?" "Nothing," Bumpy said. "Harlem does it." The 3 cars left Brooklyn at 10:45 Sunday night. Moretti rode in the middle vehicle, a black Cadillac Series 62 that he had owned for 2 years and considered the most visible marker of his position. He sat in the back with Luther Kane beside him, and he watched through the window as the car crossed into Manhattan and moved uptown through streets that grew darker and more familiar the further north they traveled. He had made this drive before, in the early stages of the Harlem operation, and it had felt then like reconnaissance, like a general reading terrain before a campaign. Tonight it was supposed to feel like ownership. He had 8 men distributed across the 3 cars. The collection disruption had not gone as planned, but the meeting at Delano's had secured enough commitments, he believed, to make the transition viable. A show of presence tonight would consolidate those commitments. Let the operators who had taken his money see that he was not managing this from Brooklyn. He was here. He was committed. The cars turned onto Lenox Avenue at 11:15. The first thing Moretti noticed was the taxis. There were 4 of them stopped along the block between 131st and 132nd, positioned in a way that wasn't quite blocking the street but required the lead car to slow significantly and navigate around them. The drivers were outside their vehicles, 2 of them talking to each other, one examining something under his hood, one standing on the sidewalk drinking coffee from a paper cup. None of them looked at the Cadillac. None of them moved with any urgency. The lead car honked twice. The drivers looked up, moved with the particular slow deliberateness of men who had no reason to hurry, and eventually the lead car found a path through. Half a block later, a delivery cart had tipped onto its side near the curb. Boxes spread across the right lane. 2 men were riding it with the unhurried efficiency of people who had done this particular job many times. The lead car slowed again. Kane felt it before he understood it. A pressure, a friction. The street was not blocked. Nothing was overtly wrong, but nothing was moving the way it should move for 3 cars trying to cover 6 blocks at a pace that communicated purpose. "Something's off," Kane said. Moretti was watching the sidewalks. The clubs and bars were open, light and music spilling through doors, people moving on the sidewalks with the normal rhythm of a Sunday night in Harlem. But here and there, men who should have been inside were standing at the edge of the light, watching the cars pass, not threateningly, just watching. On the 2nd floor of a building on 132nd Street, Maybelle Parker stood at a window with the lights off behind her. When the 3 cars came into her view, she raised her right hand and held it there for 3 seconds. Across the street, a man in a doorway saw this and walked to the corner. He said 4 words to the man standing there. That man walked half a block south and said something to a taxi driver who was still positioned with his vehicle. Sister Bernice Hall was not on the street that night. She was in the basement of Mount Moriah Baptist Church, where she had organized a late meeting about the winter heating fund. 14 women sat in folding chairs, but Sister Bernice had spoken that afternoon to 9 people across 6 blocks, and the words she had used were specific and simple. If the cars come through tonight, stay inside. Leave the street to the people who know what to do. The people who knew what to do had been ready since 9 o'clock. When the convoy reached the block between 133rd and 134th, the lead car stopped completely. A garbage truck had pulled from a side alley and was executing a 3-point turn that occupied the full width of the street. The driver moved at the methodical pace of city sanitation work, the kind of pace that communicated institutional indifference to anyone waiting behind him. Moretti's driver leaned on the horn. The garbage truck moved at the same pace. Kane's hand went to his jacket. Moretti touched his arm without looking at him. "Don't." The word came out flat and tired. He had understood, in the 90 seconds since the garbage truck appeared, what was happening. Not an ambush, not a confrontation. Something worse. The street itself was working against him. Each individual piece of it, the taxis, the delivery cart, the watching men, the garbage truck, deniable, mundane, unconnected. But together they formed a single clear message. You are not welcome here, and everyone who lives here knows it. The Cadillac's engine made a sound Moretti did not immediately identify. A rough, low knock from somewhere underneath the vehicle that grew louder over 30 seconds, and then produced a smell, sharp and chemical, that reached him through the closed windows. The driver said, "Mr. Moretti." The fire caught under the hood with a sound like a heavy book dropped on a hard floor. A dense, percussive thump that sent a column of orange light up through the seams of the hood. The driver had the door open immediately, pulling Moretti out by the arm. Kane already on the street with his weapon drawn but with nothing to point it at, because there was no one there. Only the street, the trucks and the taxis and the people in the doorways. Now looking at the burning Cadillac, with the expression of bystanders who had seen something unexpected happen to someone they didn't know. Witnesses who were present that night would later give accounts that varied considerably on certain details: the number of shots heard, whether anyone was seen near the car in the minutes before the fire, the exact sequence of events in the last block, discrepancies that reflected both the darkness and the confusion of what happened rather than any single, definitive version of events. The money that had been in the Cadillac's trunk, $150,000 in numbers revenue that Moretti had been transporting to demonstrate his operational control of Harlem's cash flow, was gone before the fire department arrived. Moretti stood on Lenox Avenue with burning metal 20 feet behind him, and 8 men who were looking at him for a direction he could not give. Kane said nothing. There was nothing to say. The strongest man in any room was never the one with the most soldiers. It was the one who could make every person on the street stand with him without being asked. Moretti had bought compliance. Bumpy had built something else entirely. By 3 Monday morning, Moretti's operation in Harlem had the shape of something that had already ended, even if the paperwork hadn't caught up yet. 6 of his 8 men from Sunday night had separated from the convoy before midnight, drifting away in pairs through side streets with the quiet efficiency of men who understood when a situation had passed its conclusion. Kane had driven Moretti back to Brooklyn in a borrowed car, a drive that covered 40 minutes of distance in 30 minutes of silence. When they arrived, Moretti went inside without a word. Kane sat in the car for a few minutes before following. There was nothing to debrief. They had both seen the same thing. The money question was what remained. Moretti had spent, across the full 10 days of the Harlem operation, a figure that several people in his organization had privately calculated, but none had yet said aloud in a room where Moretti could hear them. The envelope distributions, the soldier payments, the expenses of the meeting at Delano's, the operational costs of running 11 men in Harlem for a week. It added up to an amount that was significant even for a Brooklyn operation of Moretti's size. And the $150,000 from the Cadillac was gone. The Tuesday morning meeting at Moretti's social club in Carroll Gardens was attended by 7 men, 4 of whom were in his core organization, and 3 of whom represented arrangements with other Brooklyn crews that had been loosely affiliated with the Harlem venture. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. No transcript exists, and those present would later describe it in terms vague enough to be useless as documentation, which was, by then, everyone's preference. What came out of it was a decision to withdraw, not announced, not formalized, simply a cessation of activity. The men on salary moved to other assignments. The Brooklyn contacts in Harlem left to manage their own situations without the organizational backing that had made those contacts valuable. The operators who had taken Moretti's envelopes found themselves in the exposed position of men who had accepted payment from a party that no longer existed in any operational sense in their neighborhood. Several of them called Junie Bird's contact number within 48 hours. Bumpy received each of these calls with the same response, delivered through intermediaries with no direct attribution. The past week was the past week. Men made decisions under pressure, and some of those decisions were the wrong ones. What mattered going forward was reliability, and reliability could be reestablished if the terms of the existing arrangements were honored from this point without interruption. It was a generous response. Everyone who received it understood exactly why it was generous, which was precisely what made it effective. Captain Keegan came to the diner on Tuesday morning and sat across from Bumpy with a coffee he actually drank this time. "The Cadillac fire is being written up as an electrical fault," Keegan said. "Nobody is pressing anything further." "Good," Bumpy said. "The money in the trunk is listed as unrecovered." Keegan paused. "There's some paperwork from the Brooklyn side that could create complications if it surfaces. Names and arrangements written down by people who should have known better. Does it need to surface?" "Not necessarily." Keegan turned his cup slowly on the table. "There are people in this building who would consider it a professional favor if certain names on that paperwork remained where they currently are, which is nowhere visible." Bumpy looked at him steadily. Keegan had been navigating the space between institutional obligation and neighborhood reality for long enough that he had developed a language for these conversations that was always technically deniable and always perfectly clear. The arrangements that sustained Harlem's functional equilibrium existed in a zone that official accounts would never fully document, a reality familiar to anyone who understood how cities actually operated beneath their formal structures. "Consider it handled," Bumpy said. Keegan finished his coffee and left. Junie came in 20 minutes later and took the same seat. He looked tired. He had not slept more than 4 hours at a stretch in 10 days. Running the intelligence operation, managing the contacts, coordinating the Sunday night street action that had required more people operating in more simultaneous positions than anything he had organized before. "Moretti's people are gone," he said. "Most of them. The ones who aren't gone yet will be by the weekend." Bumpy nodded. Junie was quiet for a moment. Outside, Lenox Avenue was doing what it did on Tuesday mornings, moving with the particular rhythm of a neighborhood getting back to its ordinary business after something had passed through it. A woman walked by with 2 children. A man unlocked a shop door. A delivery truck stopped and the driver jumped down and began moving boxes with the reliable purposefulness of a man who had a route to finish. "What happens now?" Junie asked. "Now." Bumpy looked out at the street. "Now the people who were watching this decide whether we're worth more as an ally or as a target. And some of them will decide. Target." Junie understood this. Winning a conflict of this visibility did not make a man safer. It made him more precisely located on a map that other men were always reading. Every boss from Brooklyn to Midtown Manhattan now had a sharper picture of what Bumpy Johnson was capable of, which was useful and dangerous in equal measure. "You worried," Junie said. Bumpy picked up his coffee cup. "I was worried before it started. Now I'm just working." The winter that followed was, by the accounts of people who lived through it, a stable one for Harlem. The numbers operations ran without significant disruption. The clubs stayed open. The families who had been receiving quiet assistance continued to receive it. The bills paid through channels that generated no signatures and asked for no acknowledgement. Moretti was never formally prosecuted for anything related to the Harlem operation. He continued running his Brooklyn business for several more years in the diminished way of men whose reputation has been precisely and publicly damaged in a way that everyone understands and no one discusses directly. Those who survived that winter told the story quietly. Years later, in the way that people told stories about things they were still half processing. They disagreed on details. They agreed on the shape of it. Power, after a victory like that one, did not become peaceful. It became lonelier. Every man who had watched Bumpy hold Harlem through 10 days of sustained pressure now knew what he was worth, which meant they also knew what removing him would be worth. The math of that calculation never went away. It just moved to the background, patient and permanent, the way all serious threats eventually learned to wait. In the end, the man who thought Bumpy Johnson was finished learned what Harlem had always known, that this neighborhood didn't surrender. It waited. The Cadillac burned. The money vanished. And Moretti went back to Brooklyn carrying nothing but the memory of a street that had simply refused him. But power like that never rests easy. It just gets heavier. If these stories from the old Harlem nights stay with you, hit subscribe. There are more chapters where this one came from, and we'll see you in the next one. Now tell us, do you think a man like Bumpy Johnson could exist in today's world? And which was his greatest weapon, his patience, his intelligence, or the loyalty of an entire neighborhood?